to Judge Freeh. Welcome, sir. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Graham, members of the committee, thank you very much for inviting me to testify here today. When I went back and recounted all the appearances that I've made before the Congress, first one actually was in 1980 before Senator Rudman, when I was an FBI agent. But other than that, I've appeared before these two committees more than all the other committees to which the FBI director reports. And I think that's symbolic, one, of the attention that this committee and the bipartisan leadership, which I always have commended and commend today, has taken up the issues of national security and particularly counter-terrorism. Some of those hearings were requested by the committee, some were requested by myself, and this committee over the years has been outstanding in its support and its thinking ahead for the issues that we needed to deal with. I would ask the committee's indulgence for what I will try to do in a summary fashion, but which I think is going to take some more time than I had planned. First of all, I'd like to begin by expressing my condolences to the victims of not just the horrific events of September 11th, but all the victims of terrorism. And in the 26 years that I've spent as a FBI agent, an Army officer, a prosecutor, a judge, I have strived every day, as have my colleagues, to ensure that the people that we were required to protect were protected to the best of our ability. And I'd like to say here a few words about the men and women in law enforcement. And I know how much they are appreciated by this committee, but I know I speak this morning to a larger audience. All of those who serve in law enforcement and public safety go to work every day committed to laying down their lives for the people that they protect. On September 11th, dozens of law enforcement officers, firefighters, other brave people willingly did so. FBI Special Agent Lenny Hatton and retired FBI Special Agent John O'Neill unselfishly sacrificed their lives that day. John and Lenny represent the very finest of the FBI, men and women of whom I am immensely proud of, and whose courage, skill, and sacrifices and dedication in combating crime and terrorism, both here in this country and on the ground in faraway, dangerous places, deserves the nation's praise and enduring respect. It was a great and unique privilege to serve with these extraordinary Americans, and we are sincerely thankful for Director Mueller's able leadership and for the FBI so dedicated to the people it serves. I often had the occasion to work with John O'Neill. He was, as you know, the FBI's counterterrorism chief, who helped forge the historical relationship, the positive relationship between the FBI and the CIA, about which I'd like to say a few words. John and I stood together on the deck of the USS Cole in Aden shortly after the October 2000 attack against our warship. As we stood there, we watched young FBI agents reverently remove the remains of those 17 sailors from the hold of the ship, which was about 110 degrees. We watched silently and reverently as this was done and observed what was indeed an act of war against the United States. In June of 1996, John and I stood together in front of Khobar Towers in Saudi Arabia as hundreds of FBI men and women working in 120-degree temperatures sifted through tons of debris, removing human remains and evidence, intent on doing that which law enforcement can do when there is an act of war committed against America. In Dar es Salaam and Nairobi in August of 1998, again I watched hundreds of FBI men and women sifting through the shattered ruins of our embassies, recovering human remains and evidence. All of us determined to bring to justice those who had committed these acts of war against the United States. In February 1993, I was sitting in my courtroom in Foley Square when the World Trade Tower was attacked by foreign Al-Qaeda trained terrorists. I walked quickly from the courthouse. When I got to Chambers Street, I saw dozens and dozens of FBI agents streaming out of their building down the street towards the smoke-filled building. My images and memories of these painful events are both horrific and heroic. The horror and suffering of the victims balanced in a small but vital way by the bravery and heroism of the rescuers. It was amazing to me that this part of the scene was always the same. FBI men and women, whether it was New York City, Tehran, Aden, Nairobi, Dar es Salaam, exhausted, many sick and dehydrated, working until they literally dropped in some cases, down on their knees, digging with their fingers, working in harm's way. In Yemen and East Africa, to do that work, they had to be surrounded 24 hours by fast teams of U.S. Marines to protect their lives. And all the time working, pursuing justice under the rule of law. Another thing that has been a constant was the FBI's concern and support for the survivors of these horrendous acts. Their testimony in these cases speaks eloquently about the superb professionalism and dedication of the FBI's counterterrorism men and women. They have cared for and spent hundreds of hours comforting, informing, and caring for these survivors. On numerous occasions, I visited with the surviving families of the Americans killed in East Africa on board the USS Cole at Khobar Towers. We never tried to be too busy elsewhere that we stopped pursuing the killers of their loved ones. One of the most moving events in my years of public service was in June of 2001, days before I left the FBI, when all 19 families of the Khobar Towers victims came to my office and thanked me and the FBI for not forgetting about them. As I said, it was an honor to work with men like John O'Neill, thousands of others, people who you know well, Dale Watson, Cofer Black, dedicated Americans for whose bravery, skill, and absolute integrity America will always be thankful. I would also like to commend President Bush and the Congress for their immediate responses in kind to the acts of those who are responsible for the events of September 11th. Even after my 26 years of public service, I was awestruck to see a united America exercise the will and might to carry out an all-exclusive, far-reaching, and total war against terrorists who from faraway sanctuaries have threatened and attacked America for decades. I'd like to take a few minutes this morning to provide a broad overview of the terrorism threat, the FBI's role and history in fighting it. I'd also like to focus on both the successes and limitations of that mission prior to September 11th. Important, I think, because the threats and needs for resources and authorities were the same on September 10th as they were on September 12th. I'd also offer some ideas for strengthening and improving our national security without weakening the foundation upon which our country has been built, governance under the rule of law. Terrorism has been waged against us and others for centuries. It is inevitable, and it's a sad fact that it is, that every act of terrorism cannot be prevented even under the best of circumstances. If reality were otherwise, some government or regime using unlimited resources and unrestrained power would have come up with a 100% preventive formula. Our enemies from time to time are equally capable of an attack against us, especially when they are anxious to die in the endeavor. No agency or country, particularly in a democracy where the rule of law is respected, can be expected to foil and prevent every planned attack. Such a standard will never be met. Nevertheless, our law enforcement, intelligence agencies, our political, economic, military, and our diplomatic policies must strive to get as close to that 100% as humanly possible. The intelligence community and the FBI, in my opinion, does not appear to have had sufficient information to prevent the September 11th attacks. What has been stated recently to this committee in closed session, I believe, and later released, was a statement by FBI Director Mueller, and I'd like to repeat an excerpt of it. He testified before you as follows. The plans for the September 11 attacks were hatched and financed overseas over a several-year period. Each of the hijackers, apparently purposely selected to avoid notice, came easily and lawfully from abroad. While here, the hijackers effectively operated without suspicion, triggering nothing that alerted law enforcement and doing nothing that exposed them to domestic coverage. As far as we know, They contacted no known terrorist sympathizers in the United States. They committed no crimes with the exception of minor traffic violations. They dressed and acted like Americans, shopping and eating at places like Walmart and Pizza Hut. They came into different cities, moved around a lot, did not hold jobs. When Freeh got speeding tickets in the days heading up to September 11th, they remained calm and aroused no suspicion. One of the suicide hijackers, Al-Hazmi, even reported an attempted street robbery on May 1st, 2001 to Fairfax, Virginia police. He later declined to press charges. None of the 13 suicide hijackers are known to have had computers, laptops, or storage meter of any kind, although they are known to have used publicly accessible internet connections at various locations. They used 133 different prepaid calling cards to call from various payphones, cell phones, and landlines. The 19 suicide hijackers used U.S. checking accounts accessed with debit cards to conduct the majority of financial activity during the course of this conspiracy. Meetings and communications between the hijackers were done without detection. Apparent surveillance flights were taken, and nothing illegal was detected through airport security screening. In short, the terrorists had managed very effectively to exploit loopholes and vulnerabilities in our system. To this day, we have found no one in the United States except the actual hijackers who knew of the plot, and we have found nothing they did while in the United States that triggered a specific response about them. Close quote. We have read and heard much about the July 2001 memo by a Phoenix special agent, the Minnesota arrest and investigation of Moussaoui in August, and the information which the CIA obtained regarding 2 of the 19 hijackers relating to a Kuala Lumpur meeting in 2000. It is very important in hindsight to segregate this relevant information and put it into a dedicated timeline. However, the predictive value of these diverse facts at the time that they were being received must be evaluated. Analyzing intelligence information can be like trying to take a sip of water coming out of a fire hydrant. The several bits of information, clearly connected and predictive after the fact, need to be viewed in real time. The reality is that these unquestionably important bits have been plucked from a sea of thousands and thousands of such bits at the time. Additionally, as this committee well knows, the difference between strategic and tactical intelligence is critically important to keep in mind. Although not privy to all the relevant information known to this committee, I am aware of nothing that to me demonstrates that the FBI and the intelligence community had the type of information or tactical intelligence which could have prevented the horror of September 11th. In terms of the FBI's capability to identify, investigate, and prevent 19 hijackers from carrying out their attacks, the facts so far in the public record do not support the conclusion that these tragic events could have been prevented by the FBI and intelligence community acting by themselves. This is not to say things could have been done better or that more resources or authorities would not have helped. It is only to say I have not seen a reporting of facts that leads to that conclusion, with one important caveat. Because of the narrow focus of this inquiry, I leave aside any view of the larger but very relevant issues raised even this morning by Eleanor Hill, like foreign policy, military might, airline safety, national commitment. Identification, investigation, and arrest of dangerous terrorists and those who support them is prevention. I'd like to try to dispel the notion that investigation is not part of prevention. I think Mary Jo White will speak about that a little bit. For instance, the FBI's criminal investigation of the 1993 World Trade Tower bombing led directly to the discovery and prosecution of a terrorist plot to blow up New York City tunnels, buildings, and infrastructure, which would have killed thousands of innocent people. The FBI's investigation at that time led to evidence and witnesses whose cooperation directly prevented a major terrorist attack. In my experience, the identification, pursuit, and arrest of terrorists are the primary means of preventing terrorism in some cases. The FBI and CIA have jointly been doing this successfully for many years. Our investigation and pursuit of Ramzi Youssef after the World Trade Center bombing in 1993 led to the Philippines and helped to prevent his plot to blow up 11 United States airliners in the Western Pacific. His arrest in Pakistan by FBI agents certainly prevented him from carrying out further acts of terrorism against America. Bringing Yosef and the East African embassy bombers back to the United States and convicting them in New York City without a doubt prevented them from carrying out more terrorism against America. As these committees have known for several years, the FBI and CIA have carried out joint operations around the world to disrupt, exploit, and recover evidence on al-Qaeda operatives who have targeted the United States. These operations, in part, designed to obtain admissible evidence, also had the critical objectives of destroying the operational capability of terrorist organizations, collecting valuable intelligence, and being able to support our military should such a response be unleashed. Law enforcement's ability to act against entrenched terrorists in overseas sanctuaries is very limited. And I'll repeat here in theme another point made by your counsel this morning. The FBI and CIA can devise and implement a very effective counter-terrorism strategy both inside the United States and overseas. However, often a greater involvement of national resources is required. For instance, General Noriega was investigated and indicted by the Department of Justice in 1988, operating out of what he thought was a safe foreign haven. Noriega and his military-like organization were sending tons of deadly drugs into the United States, causing the deaths and devastation of countless Americans. The FBI and DEA built the case and executed the arrest warrant on Noriega in Panama only because our military can and did do what law enforcement and intelligence cannot do. Osama bin Laden was indicted in 1998, actually prior to al-Qaeda's bombings of our embassies in East Africa. Like Noriega, Osama bin Laden remains secure and operational in his foreign safe haven. Once the collective will to go in and get him was summoned, it happened with striking speed. Pan Am 103 bombing is another such example of an FBI case where the Libyan intelligence service was the target of our investigation. I certainly don't equate Noriega and Osama bin Laden in terms of their destructiveness or evil. However, the comparison makes an obvious but often overlooked point that our response to terrorism must be expansive, unmistakable, and unwavering across all levels of the United States government. I particularly want to commend George Tenet and the courageous men and women of the CIA for fighting bravely on the front lines of this war for many years. Under Mr. Tenet's sound leadership, dedication, and vision, the CIA has achieved great successes in rolling up major terrorist plots in Albania, Jordan, Southeast Asia, many other places. Importantly, the CIA and FBI have been fully cooperating and jointly carrying out America's counterterrorism war for many years. And I will make this point again and again this morning. The coordination between the FBI and the CIA in counterterrorism, in my 8 years of experience, has been exemplary. They formed, the FBI and the CIA, the first joint dedicated al-Qaeda Osama bin Laden cell to study it a year prior to the August 1998 East African embassy bombings. But the fact is that working at their best and highest levels of efficiency and cooperation, the FBI and CIA together will fall short of war, a total war against terrorism. As these committees well know, total war, as we have recently done it, requires bold leadership supported by the will of Congress and the American people. Its success is ultimately dependent upon the united and unrelenting efforts of foreign policy, military assets, vast resources, legal authorities, and international alliances and cooperation. I realize that your committee's efforts have been publicly focused for the most part on the intelligence community and the FBI. And I'm confident that the upcoming commission, should there be one, will more fully examine these broader issues with a global view. It should be obvious, for instance, that the FBI, with about 3.5% of the country's counterterrorism budget, and the CIA, with their share, comprise but pieces of a mosaic of a total government commitment needed to fight the war on terrorism. For instance, U.S. airlines and aviation have long been known as a major target for terrorist attacks. I've cited in my statement a 1996 GAO report which concluded, quote, nearly every major aspect of the system, ranging from the screening of passengers, checked and carry-on baggage, mail and cargo, as well as access to secured areas within airports and aircraft, has weaknesses that terrorists could exploit, close quote. In the aftermath of the tragedy of TWA Flight 800 in New York City, the White House Commission on Aviation Safety and Security was formed. I, along with New York City Police Department Commissioner Ray Kelly, Bill Coleman, Franklin Raines, Jim Hall, and other distinguished Americans, served as commissioners appointed by President Clinton. Chairman of the commission was Vice President Al Gore, who did an excellent job leading the effort and making much-needed recommendations. Known as the Gore Commission, the panel made its final report and recommendations on February 12, 1997. For example, in recommendation 3.19, entitled Complement Technology with Automated Passenger Profiling, this contemplated the development of a passenger profiling system wherein law enforcement and intelligence information on known or suspected terrorists would be used in passenger profiling. The critical issue of terrorism directed against our aviation security was well known for many years prior to September 11th. As this committee knows, the FBI conveyed repeated warnings to the FAA and the airline industry regarding terrorism right up to September 11, 2001. Efforts by the government and the airline industry to implement these and other recommendations deserve intensive and careful study and most likely massive resources. This is not to criticize the FAA, which does a difficult job very well. Rather, the point is that while the CIA and the FBI should be intensely examined regarding September 11th, they should not be examined in a vacuum. The executive and the Congress, the various government agencies with primary responsibility for public safety and national security, foreign policy, technologies, as well as the private sector and the international community, are all components in whether or not terrorism is addressed with the vigor it deserves. You've asked me to talk about resource allocation and whether sufficient resources were allocated to and within the FBI for fighting terrorism. The short answer is that the allocations were insufficient to maintain the critical growth and priority of the FBI's counterterrorism program. The Gore Commission agreed when it recommended, quote, that we significantly increase the number of FBI agents assigned to counterterrorism investigations to improve intelligence and to crisis response. In 1993, the FBI had under 600 special agents and 500 support positions funded for its entire counterterrorism program, domestic and international. By 1999, that allocation had increased to about 1,300 agents and a like amount of support positions. While at first blush that may sound like a lot, the FBI had requested significantly more counterterrorism resources during this period. And I note for the record that this committee supported those recommendations as best it could. This was done because I had made the prevention, disruption, and defeat of terrorism one of the FBI's highest priorities. We knew that many areas like analysis and technology needed huge influxes of new resources. Let me read from our May 8, 1998 strategic plan. Quote, the FBI has identified 3 general functional areas that describe the threats which it must address to realize the goal of enhanced national and individual security. Tier 1, national and economic security, foreign intelligence, terrorist, and criminal activities that directly threaten the national and economic security of the United States. Quote, these offenses fall almost exclusively within the jurisdiction of the FBI. Issues arising in this area are of such importance to U.S. national interest that they must receive priority attention. To succeed, we must develop and implement a proactive, nationally directed program. Strategic goal, prevent, disrupt, and defeat terrorism operations before they occur. Terrorism is both international and domestic, poses arguably the most complex and difficult threat of any of the threats for which the FBI has a major responsibility. New perpetrators, loosely organized groups, and ad hoc coalitions of foreigners motivated by perceived injustices, along with domestic groups and disgruntled American citizens, have attacked United States interests at home and abroad. The dilemma, of course, is that the new perpetrators' targets and weapons exist in almost unlimited numbers, while the law enforcement resources arrayed against them are finite. In my report to the American people on the FBI in 1998, entitled, quote, "Ensuring Public Safety and National Security Under the Rule of Law," I wrote, quote, "One of my major priorities has been to seek increased funding for the FBI's counterterrorism programs. The Congress has shown great foresight in strengthening this vital work. For example, the counterterrorism budget for fiscal year 1996 was $97 million. The fiscal year 1999 budget contains $301 million for counterterrorism efforts. Quote, "Some terrorism now comes from abroad. Some terrorism is homegrown. But whatever its origin, terrorism is deadly, and the FBI has no higher priority than to combat terrorism, to prevent it where possible. Our goal is to prevent, detect, and deter foreign terrorists in the United States." And a lot of this goes to the point of whether we were focused on domestic threats from terrorists. Terrorism, quote, "can be carried out by U.S. citizens or by persons from other countries. At one time, these crimes erupting in much of the world, many Americans felt we were immune from terrorism with foreign links. All that ended in 1993. The type of terrorism which had previously occurred far from our shores was brought home in a shocking manner when in February a massive explosion occurred in the parking garage at the World Trade Center complex in New York City. The 1998-2000 period was critical and unprecedented regarding both the changes in and the demands on the FBI's counterterrorism program and its domestic and international responsibilities. As examples, we indicted Osama bin Laden in June of 1998 and again in November 1998. We put bin Laden and al-Qaeda on the FBI's top 10 list in April of 1999, making them our #1 counterterrorism priority. Also in 1999, we set up a dedicated Osama bin Laden unit at FBI headquarters. We stood up for overseas deployment 5 rapid deployment teams to respond to terrorist threats against America around the world. With help from Congress, we began to position ourselves around the globe in places that matter in the fight against terrorism. Without our FBI legats, the post-September 11th advances could never have been made with such speed and surety. We doubled and tripled the number of joint terrorism task forces around the United States so we could multiply our forces and coordinate intelligence and counterterrorism operations with the FBI's federal, state, and local law enforcement partners. 34 of these JTTFs were in operation by 2001. The FBI was also given national responsibility for coordinating the protection of the nation's critical infrastructure. As a result, we created the National Infrastructure Protection Center at FBI headquarters, which had critical responsibilities regarding terrorist threats and cyber attacks. We were also tasked to set up the National Domestic Preparedness Office to counter terrorist threats and to enhance homeland security. We began making preparations for the 2000 Olympics, the Millennium, United Nations and NATO meetings in New York City, World Cup, IMF World Bank events, presidential conventions, and other major events which absorbed vast numbers of FBI counterterrorism resources. At the same time, we were conducting major terrorism investigations leading up to the successful prosecution in New York City of the al-Qaeda members who attacked our embassies in Africa. We stood up the massive Strategic Information Operations Center at FBI headquarters, whose main purpose was to give us the capability to work several major and simultaneous terrorist matters at the same time. We established the FBI's Counterterrorism Center at FBI headquarters, which was coordinated with the CIA's center by communications, information exchange, and personnel staffing.
Judge Freeh, may I interrupt you, sir, for a moment?
Certainly.
Members have been notified by bells that we have a vote in the House. I understand there's a 15-minute vote followed by 2 5s. The 15-minute vote has about probably 8-9 minutes left on it. We will be excusing ourselves to run over and make those votes, but I understand that we will continue on, and Chairman Graham will be taking over. Excuse me for the interruption, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Freeh. Continue, please.
We instituted Max Cap 05 in July 2000 to enable each of our FBI's 56 field offices and their special agents in charge to improve our counterterrorism efforts, analyze threats, and develop capabilities and strategies throughout the United States. Regional SAC conferences were held during the summer of 2000 to roll out the Max Cap 5 strategy. We set up a national threat warning system in order to disseminate terrorism-related information to state and local authorities around the country. We organized and carried out a significant number of national, regional, and local practice exercises to help the country prepare for terrorist attacks. The Attorney General and I conducted regular meetings with the National Security Advisor, the Secretary of State, dedicated to terrorism issues, cases, and threats. I met with dozens of presidents, prime ministers, kings, emirs, law enforcement, intelligence, and security chiefs around the world. The primary reason for these contacts was to pursue and enhance our counterterrorism program by forging an international network of cooperation. We proposed and briefly received from the Congress the authority to hire critical scientists, linguists, and computer specialists without the salary restrictions of Title V. The Department of Justice and the FBI prepared hundreds of FISA court applications in counterterrorism matters. I regularly met with and discussed counterterrorism issues, intelligence, and force protection issues with the Attorney General, the National Security Advisor, United States attorneys, the Secretaries of Defense and State, our ambassadors, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Perhaps most significantly, as to the issue of our focus on the terrorist threat, in November of 1999, I created a new FBI counterterrorism division. Nobody in the executive or the Congress suggested that this step be taken. I took it because I firmly believed it was necessary to expand and enhance the FBI's counterterrorism capability. Dale Watson was elevated to run this new division and develop new strategies. At the same time, I proposed the creation of a new investigative services division to support the new counterterrorism division, as well as the criminal and national security divisions. My purpose in doing so was to put together all of the FBI's analytical and support assets in order to better prevent terrorism and enhance our intelligence bases with the resources we had available. 9 months later, this reorganization was approved, and the FBI for the first time consolidated its counterterrorism program assets with the support of a greater analytical engine. In February 2001, we held a national counterterrorism conference to roll out details of the MaxCap 5 strategy. The 2000, 2001, and 2002 pre-September 11th budgets fell far short of the counterterrorism resources we knew were necessary to do the best job. This is not meant as a criticism, but a reminder for the record that total war against terrorists was not the same priority before September 11th as it is today. Here are the numbers. For fiscal years 2000, 2001, and 2002 FBI counterterrorism budgets, I asked for a total of 1,895 special agents, analysts, linguists, and others. The final enacted allocation we received was 76 people over those 3 years. In fiscal year 2000, I requested 864 additional counterterrorism people at a cost of $380.8 million. I received 5 people funded for $7.4 million. Thus, at the most critical time, the available resources for counterterrorism did not address the known critical needs. By contrast, in response to the FBI's fiscal year 2002 emergency supplemental request for counterterrorism-related resources, Congress enacted 823 positions and $745 million in new funding, all things which we needed prior to September 11th. Final note on FBI resources to carry out its critical mission, including waging war against terrorists. To win a war, it takes soldiers. Frontline troops, as you know, each require several more to support them. I don't know if your staff has advised you, but even after September 11th, the FBI has less FBI agents today, 11,516 special agents, than it had in 1999, when the number was 11,681. By way of comparison, in 1992, before I became director, the FBI had 10,479. That's only 1,037 less than today, an average annual growth of about 103 special agents per year over the last decade. We must also keep in mind that these 11,516 special agents have responsibility for other immensely important and resource-consuming programs, including new jobs regularly imposed by Congress without any additional resources. With less FBI agents than the Chicago Police Department has sworn officers, the immensely important responsibilities of the FBI are not proportionally represented in its most basic resource, soldiers. Again, this is not by way of criticism. I do not think that at the time the national priority existed for the resources that are needed for this critical need, and I hope that they do now. I would urge you to significantly increase the personnel of the FBI and to favorably consider pending legislation that would more fairly compensate them for the life-saving work they do every day. Further, it is critical that we fully support and demonstrate that support for our FBI agents and CIA officers. One example how we could do this better can be found in a recommendation by the National Commission on Terrorism. It noted, quote, "The risk of personal liability arising from actions taken in an official capacity discourages law enforcement and intelligence personnel from taking bold actions to combat terrorism. FBI special agents and CIA officers are buying personal liability insurance, which provides for private representation in some suits. By recent statute, federal agencies must reimburse up to 1/2 of the cost of personal liability insurance for law enforcement officers and managers or supervisors. We need to support the brave men and women whom we ask to take great risk for us every day." The FBI was focused both on preventing domestic and foreign terrorist attacks, and I take exception to the finding that we were not sufficiently paying attention to terrorism at home. As I stated earlier, and as reflected in the strategic report and the 5-year report, the 1993 bombing of the World Trade Center by foreign terrorists clearly demonstrated the effort to target America and Americans. Osama bin Laden's 1998 fatwa, calling for the deaths of Americans anywhere, left no doubt that terrorist attacks within the United States were as likely as those in Saudi Arabia, East Africa, Yemen, and elsewhere. More convincingly, the failed efforts by Rassam and his New York City-based co-conspirators to carry out a major terrorist attack within the United States at the end of 1999 made the FBI focus intently on protecting Homeland Security. Indeed, the FBI investigation of the USS Cole attack and CIA efforts overseas led to our conclusion that the millennial attacks by Rassam on the West Coast were planned to coincide with other al-Qaeda-sponsored attacks in Jordan and Yemen. The Jordanian attack was prevented by the CIA acting together with the Jordanian Intelligence Service. The al-Qaeda suicide bombers of the USS Cole had previously planned to attack another U.S. warship, the USS Sullivans, which was docked at the same fuel pod the USS Cole used in October 2000. The early attack was postponed only because the bomb-laden attack boat sunk when it was launched. So before the end of 1999, the FBI and the intelligence community clearly understood the foreign-based al-Qaeda threat regarding targets within the United States. Congress and the executive were fully briefed as to this threat analysis, particularly the leadership and membership of these committees in hearings, briefings, Stu 3 calls late at night and over the weekend were continuously apprised of this threat. In several appearances before this committee, I used the chart to depict the locations around the United States where radical fundamental cells were active. The FBI fought unsuccessfully to continue fingerprinting and photographing visiting nationals from key state sponsors of terrorism states because of our concern that intelligence agents were being sent here to support these radical elements within America. The notion that the FBI, other law enforcement agencies, the Department of Justice, and the intelligence community were not focused on homeland threats is not accurate and belied by many factors. For example, as we prepared for and conducted the several major trials of al-Qaeda members, Osama bin Laden, remember, was charged as a defendant in those indictments in New York City during 1999 to 2000. Extraordinary security steps were taken to prevent an al-Qaeda attack. If any of you saw Foley Square, the federal courthouse, and the area around City Hall, 26 Federal Plaza, and the New York Police Department during that time, it was totally fortified. The closed streets, cement trucks, barricades, checkpoints, and hundreds of heavily armed officers and agents were not set up to prevent the al-Qaeda subjects from escaping from the courthouse. These unprecedented security measures, enhanced after September 11th, were designed to stop al-Qaeda attacking the court, which found their own members guilty of blowing up our embassies in Africa. Similarly, Pennsylvania Avenue was ordered closed by the National Security Advisor, and the White House, after the United States Secret Service Director and I made a presentation which showed that a terrorist vehicle bomb could destroy the West Wing. Prior to September 11th, an incredible number of innovative and costly measures were regularly implemented by the FBI and the law enforcement community around the country at special events, conventions, inaugurations, public gatherings, to prevent, among other threats, foreign-based terrorists like Rassam and Yosef from attacking targets here. The radical fundamentalist threat posed a clear and present danger here, and everyone knew it and understood it to be the same. At the same time, the FBI was critically focused and active regarding the terrorist threat to Americans overseas. Much of that activity I have recounted above. Beginning in 1993, shortly after I became director, I determined that to protect America at home, the FBI needed to significantly increase its international role and liaison with our foreign law enforcement and security counterparts. I determined that to have an effective counterterrorism program that protected Americans in their homes and offices, the FBI had to have its agents in Cairo, Islamabad, Tel Aviv, Ankara, Riyadh, and other critical locations around the world. We opened FBI legal offices in those countries to strengthen our counterterrorism program. The critical alliances and partnerships with the law enforcement and security services in those countries has paid enormous benefits and has protected this nation and our people from acts of terrorism. We later were able to open FBI legal offices in Amman, Almaty, New Delhi. When I left the FBI in June of '01, I had pending requests to establish FBI offices in 13 additional countries, having already more than doubled the FBI presence overseas. I was pleased recently to learn that my prior requests to open offices in Tunis, Kuala Lumpur, Tbilisi, Sana, and Abu Dhabi have been approved. The FBI must have this foreign presence and capability to have an effective counterterrorism policy. When I left the FBI, I had proposed that we establish an FBI training facility in Central Asia, as we had done in Budapest in 1996 and had begun in Dubai, to enhance our ability to establish liaison and critical points of contacts in those regions. Many FBI personnel and I spent an enormous amount of time traveling overseas in order to establish an international counterterrorism capability. Because of that, in 1998, I was able to negotiate the return of 2 al-Qaeda bombers from Kenya so they could be tried and convicted for the embassy bombings. In 2000, I met with President Musharraf in Pakistan and negotiated the availability of a critical witness in one of our major terrorism prosecutions. I briefed him on the indictment against bin Laden regarding the 1998 embassy bombings and asked for his assistance in capturing him in Afghanistan. FBI agents and a prosecutor from the United States Attorney's Office from the Southern District later returned to Pakistan to continue those efforts. In 1996, I met with Presidents Nazarbayev and Karimov in Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, respectively, and discussed radical fundamentalist terrorism directed against the United States from Afghanistan and Iran. I asked for their help in fighting these threats to America. I traveled extensively, as did scores of FBI men and women, throughout the Mideast, Central Asia, Africa, the Persian Gulf, and South America, with a very primary objective of strengthening our counterterrorism program so we could protect Americans at home. Dozens of special agents went to places like the tri-border area in South America, Southeast Asia, Africa, Greece, Georgia, Russia, and many other places to carry out our counterterrorism mission. For example, these relationships have paid enormous benefits. When we were examining the forensic evidence from the USS Cole case, we discovered that the explosive used was probably manufactured in Russia. Because the FBI had been working in Russia since 1994, I was able to call the FSB director and ask for assistance. His response was immediate. Russian explosive agents and experts provided the FBI with all the necessary forensic and expert information requested, helping the case immensely. The 1996 Cole bombing investigation demonstrates the FBI's success and limitations in combating foreign-based terrorists who wage war against the United States. The FBI's 1996 Cole Bombing investigation is a prime example of the FBI's success in combating terrorism because of solid relationships with our foreign partners. It also points to the limitations in dealing with these acts strictly as criminal cases. After that devastating terrorist attack on June 25, 1996, which killed 19 United States airmen and wounded hundreds more, the FBI was instructed to mount a full-scale criminal investigation. We immediately dispatched several hundred FBI personnel to Dhahran, Saudi Arabia, and supported by our armed forces, established a crime scene, interviewed available witnesses, obtained evidence, and set out leads and a plan. Working in close cooperation with the White House, State Department, the CIA, and Department of Defense, I made a series of trips to Saudi Arabia in order to further the FBI's investigation. Because the FBI's prior contacts with the Saudi Police Service, the Mubahith, and Interior Ministry had been carried on from offices as far away as Rome and Cairo, the FBI lacked any effective liaison or relationship with its counterpart agencies in Riyadh. Fortunately, the FBI was able to forge an effective working relationship with the Saudi Police and Interior Ministry. After several trips and meetings with the Saudi leadership, and particularly Prince Nayef, the Interior Minister, the FBI was granted permission to expand its presence and joint operational capability within the kingdom. I was particularly fortunate to gain the trust and cooperation of Prince Bandar bin Sultan, the Saudi ambassador to the United States, who was critical in achieving the FBI's investigative objectives in the Cole Bar case. Due to Prince Bandar's forthcoming support and personal efforts, the FBI was able to establish an FBI office in Riyadh. Our Arabic-speaking special agent, who became the first FBI agent to be assigned to Saudi Arabia, quickly made critical liaison and relationships of trust were established between the FBI and the Mubahith. Evidence and access to important witnesses were obtained, and excellent investigative support was furnished to various teams of FBI agents who worked in Saudi Arabia to pursue the case. In one instance, Canadian authorities acting on Saudi information arrested a Cole Bar subject who was brought to the United States and thereafter sent by the Attorney General to Saudi Arabia for prosecution. The cooperation the FBI received as a result of Princes Bandar and Nayef's personal intervention and support was unprecedented and invaluable. From time to time, a roadblock or legal obstacle would occur, which was expected given the marked differences between our legal and procedural systems. Despite these challenges, the problems were always solved by the personal intervention of Prince Bandar and his consistent support for the FBI. The case almost faltered on the issue of the FBI's critical request for direct access to 6 Saudi nationals who were being detained in the kingdom and who had admitted participation in the Cole Bar bombing. One of these subjects, who had been returned to Saudi Arabia from another country, had key information which would later implicate senior Iranian government officials as responsible for the planning, funding, and execution of this attack. We needed direct access to these subjects because their admissions and testimony were critical to support our prosecution. Yet no FBI agent had ever been given such unprecedented access to a detained Saudi national, which access could potentially taint their prosecution under Islamic law. For the same reasons, the FBI would have been very reluctant to allow Saudi police officers to come to the United States and interview a subject under like conditions. Moreover, by making these witnesses directly available to the FBI, the Saudis understood that they would be helping to provide evidence that senior officials of the government of Iran were responsible for the Cole Bar attack. Despite these extremely sensitive and complex issues, the Saudis put their own interests aside to aid the FBI in the United States. Supported by Prince Bandar, Prince Nayef, the police, and Crown Prince Abdullah, they decided to grant the FBI request to interview the detainees. Ambassador Fowler closely worked with me in this endeavor, and we finally succeeded. Teams of FBI agents were then able to have access to these critical detainees, and full debriefings were conducted in Saudi Arabia. As a direct result of these and later direct interviews, the Department of Justice was able to return a criminal indictment in June 2001, charging 13 defendants with the murders of our 19 servicemen. The indictment was returned just days before the statute of limitations would have run on some of the criminal charges. This case could not have been made without the critical support and active assistance of Saudi Arabia and the State Department through Ambassador Fowler. The direct evidence obtained strongly indicated that the 1996 bombings were sanctioned, funded, and directed by senior officials of the government of Iran. The Ministry of Intelligence and Security and the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps were shown to be culpable for carrying out the operation. The bombers were trained by Iranians in the Bekaa Valley. Unfortunately, the indicted subjects who are not in custody remain fugitives, some of whom are believed to be in Iran. Khobar represented a national security threat far beyond the capability or authority of the FBI or Department of Justice to address. Neither the FBI director nor the Attorney General could or should decide America's response to such a grave threat. While on the one hand, Khobar demonstrated the capability of the FBI, acting in cooperation with its foreign counterparts overseas, to work successfully under extremely complex conditions to pursue criminal cases, it also demonstrated that an act of war against the United States, whether committed by a terrorist organization or by a foreign state, can receive only a limited response by the FBI making a criminal case. Mr. Watson recounted a meeting that he and I had with you, Senator Shelby, and Senator Bob Kerrey. We came up to brief you on the Khobar attack and how the FBI case was proceeding. And I remember very much as we discussed this, you and Senator Kerrey commended the FBI for working on this matter, but you also commented that the FBI was somewhat out of its depth combating an act of war, much graver than merely a horrific crime. I never lost sight of that fact, and its truth is even more apparent after September 11th. The FBI always viewed these investigations as secondary to any national security action and severely limited in their overall impact on a faraway enemy such as Al-Qaeda. I always stressed that the FBI investigations were completely secondary to the needs of our national security. The National Commission on Terrorism made this point convincingly by using the pursuit of the Pan Am 103 case, investigated by the FBI, as an example of the more aggressive national strategy needed against this scale of terrorism. I quote from the Commission's finding, "Law enforcement is designed to put individuals behind bars, but is not a particularly useful tool for addressing actions by states. The Pan Am 103 case demonstrates the advantages and limitations of the law enforcement approach to achieve national security objectives. The effort to seek extradition of the two intelligence operatives implicated most directly in the bombing gained international support for economic sanctions that a more political approach may have failed to achieve. The sanctions and the resulting isolation of Libya may have contributed to the reduction of Libya's terrorist activities. On the other hand, prosecuting and punishing two low-level operatives for an act almost certainly directed by Gaddafi is a hollow victory, particularly if the trial results in his implicit exoneration," close quote. The Commission concluded that, quote, "Iran remains the most active supporter of terrorism. The IRGC and MIS have continued to be involved in the planning and execution of terrorist attacks. They also provide funding, training, weapons, logistical resources, and guidance to a variety of terrorist groups, including Lebanese Hezbollah, Hamas, PIJ, and PFLP-GC," quote, close quote. The Commission noted that, quote, "In October 1999, President Clinton officially requested cooperation from Iran in the investigation of the Khobar bombing. Thus far, Iran has not responded. International pressure in the Pan Am 103 case ultimately succeeded in getting some degree of cooperation from Libya. The United States government has not sought similar multilateral action in bringing pressure on Iran to cooperate in the Khobar Towers bombing investigation," close quote. We must always recognize the limitations inherent in a law enforcement response. As we see at this very moment in history, others, to include Congress, must decide if our national will dictates a fuller response. I'm going to skip the section on pages 89 to 102, I know without objection, with respect to our information technology issues, and say briefly there that we were far behind in our ability to acquire and have funded the information technology required by a competent law enforcement and counterintelligence, counterterrorism agency. There's a long history there. I've set it out for you I take some responsibility for the delay. The good news is that when I left the FBI, we were on track to the full funding of the Trilogy program, which this committee is well aware of, and which will put us back in the race with respect to IT. In addition to IT, other critical technology assistance is required for the FBI to continue an effective war against terrorism. In 1994, as a result of the FBI's own initiative, Congress passed the Communications Assistance to Law Enforcement Act, CALEA. This critical statute was vital to ensuring that law enforcement could maintain the technical ability to conduct court-authorized electronic surveillance. Against tremendous opposition, the FBI persuaded Congress that this selectively utilized technique was essential to working its most complex criminal and national security cases. Support from Chairman Leahy, Senator Hatch, and many other members was critical in this legislation. The law simply allows the FBI to continue its court-controlled use of this capacity as the telecommunications world changes from an analog to a digital network. It has taken most of the last 8 years to fund and implement CALEA, and faster progress needs to be made. But CALEA simply permits the FBI to maintain court-approved access to digital communications and stored data. Another technical challenge called encryption then and now threatens to make court-authorized interception orders a nullity. Robust and commercially available encryption products are proliferating, and no legal means has been provided to law enforcement to deal with this problem, as was recently done in by Parliament in the United Kingdom. Terrorists, drug traffickers, and criminals have been able to exploit this huge vulnerability in the public safety matrix. Many of you have heard me and others testify before you over the years about this problem. The International Association of Chiefs of Police, the 50 state attorneys general, the National Association of District Attorneys have all identified this problem as the most critical technology issue facing law enforcement. Many of you, Chairman Goss, who's not here right now, Representative Norm Dix, Senator Kyle, Senator DeWine, and Senator Feinstein particularly, have provided outstanding leadership and gone to great lengths to address this problem. In 1998, HPSI adopted a substitute bill to S909, which effectively addressed all of law enforcement, public safety, and terrorism-related concerns regarding encryption products. Unfortunately, this needed counterterrorism assistance was not enacted. As we know now from Ramzi Youssef's encrypted computer files found in Manila, terrorists are exploiting this technology to defeat our most sophisticated methods to prevent their attacks. I have long said and repeat here today that this unaddressed problem creates a huge vulnerability in our nation's counterterrorism program. Neither the Patriot Act nor any likely to be enacted statute at this time even attempts to close this gap. Resolving this issue is critical for Homeland Security. In 1995, Congress authorized the FBI to establish a technical support center. The purpose of this facility was to provide federal and local law enforcement with the technical tools to improve court-authorized telecommunication interceptions and signal access for investigative purposes. I was pleased to see that this critical center was fully funded subsequent to September 11th. Many other critical technology needs must be addressed, both with legal authorization, such as the once proposed Cyberspace Electronic Security Act bill, and significant new resources for counterterrorism, cyber terrorism, and dealing with weapons of mass destruction and proliferation. Unfortunately, the convergence of technology and globalization now enable an individual terrorist or a small group of terrorists operating from the other side of the world in a protected sanctuary or operating in our backyard enables them to threaten our nation in devastating ways. I think we need to acknowledge that the rules governing the FBI's counterterrorism efforts changed as a result of September 11th. We must acknowledge that the rules are changing, beginning with certain provisions of the USA Patriot Act. The Department of Justice and the intelligence agencies have been given new tools, as the statute is entitled, to combat a dangerous enemy who follows no rules. Some of these new authorities have been granted by the Congress with a sunset provision. Some asserted by the government are being challenged in the courts, where they will ultimately be decided. It must always be understood that prior to September 11th, the FBI, as it always must, followed the rules as they were given to us by the Attorney General and the Congress. For example, FBI agents were not permitted without special circumstances to visit a suspect group's website or to attend its public meetings. Counterintelligence, domestic terrorism, and informant guidelines promulgated years ago and updated with new restrictions curtailed our ability to collect information in national security cases. Those guidelines are now being changed. Primary purpose requirements for FISA applications and information separation structures limited the sharing of criminal and intelligence information. Grand jury and Title III secrecy provisions severely restricted the dissemination of criminal terrorist information obtained during those processes. I repeatedly testified before Congress that FBI agents were statutorily barred from obtaining portions of credit reports on national security subjects when used car dealers could order them and read them. Before we interviewed detained foreign national al-Qaeda subjects in East Africa, in connection with the East African bombings, FBI agents duly gave them their Miranda rights. And when I left the FBI in June of 2001, we were being criticized in some quarters because a valuable new electronic tool necessary to read a terrorist's email pursuant to a court order had the hypothetical potential to be abused, as any law enforcement tool could be. Everyone understands why and how some of the rules changed after September 11th. But it's important to understand that the rules were changed by changed circumstances, and that those circumstances changed the standards and expectations of both the FBI and the CIA. During my tenure as FBI director, I was immensely proud of the cooperation and integration of FBI and CIA efforts to combat terrorism. Myself and recent DCIs, particularly George Tenet, have taken bold and unprecedented steps to work together and forge an effective FBI-CIA partnership to combat terrorism, exchanging senior officers, standing up the joint Osama bin Laden al-Qaeda Operations and Intelligence Center, fully coordinating our legat and station chiefs. Cross-training and many additional measures were taken to integrate our counterterrorism resources and capabilities. Our joint efforts in the East African bombings is a template of how successful we were in working together. Some of these efforts cannot be described in this session. This historical and successful integration does not mean that on every point of intersection a lapse did not occur, but to focus on those isolated instances while ignoring the huge successes of this top-down directed integration is misplaced. I personally credit George Tenet with making this happen and winning the trust and respect of the FBI in the process. The best confirmation, by the way, of this fully integrated FBI-CIA counterterrorism effort is the fact that during my tenure, no chairman or member of this committee ever raised with me, or the DCI to my knowledge, the issue of our agencies being uncooperative or adverse to working together. Conversely, it was repeatedly pointed out to me by your committees that the FBI and CIA were working together in an exemplary manner. I end with some recommendations. 1, provide legal authority and significant new funding enabling the FBI to manage encryption technology. 2, significantly increase the number of FBI special agents and support positions with sufficient compensation required to recruit and retain the best men and women to combat terrorism. 3, significantly increase the FBI's technical support program and facilitate the FBI's access to emerging technologies and research and development by the private sector. 4, significantly increase the number and staffing of FBI legat offices overseas. 5, exempt the FBI from the compensation restrictions of Title V. 6, change the FBI's procurement procedures to facilitate the efficient design and acquisition of equipment and technology. 7, provide new funding for the FBI's international training programs and put the FBI in charge of all international law enforcement training. 8, fund whatever it takes to achieve interoperability between all the agencies engaged in the war against terrorism. 9, restructure the budget to give more flexibility to the DCI, Attorney General, and the FBI Director to better allocate program funding and resources as missions evolve and new threats emerge. 10, consider establishing a domestic public safety office in the executive with responsibility for coordinating and supporting national law enforcement issues. Finally, enhance the legal, technical, and funding resources of the FBI rather than consider creating an intelligence agency to share its domestic public safety responsibilities. In conclusion, The FBI and CIA working together have accomplished much in fighting terrorism at home and abroad, but it is a constant and continuing battle. These agencies should remain the primary counterterrorism agencies for this mission. The DCI's authority for coordinating and implementing government-wide efforts in this regard should be expanded. The war against terrorism must be waged relentlessly. It will require that significantly more resources be allocated to the FBI and CIA. These fine agencies and the brave men and women who fight this war cannot defeat some forms of terrorism without total government intervention, no matter how great and heroic their efforts. Al-Qaeda-type organizations, state sponsors of terrorism like Iran, and the threats they pose to America are beyond the competence of the FBI and the CIA to address. America must maintain the will in some cases to use its political, military, and economic power in response when acts of war are threatened or committed against our nation by terrorists or their state sponsors. Finally, however treacherous the enemy, the FBI must fight this war as a law enforcement agency of the Department of Justice, governed by the rule of law and the Constitution. The rules, statutes, and guidelines which establish the legal authorities of the FBI may change, as they did significantly after September 11th, as long as those changes are clearly defined and understood. The FBI's adherence to the Constitution and the rule of law must not change. We do not have to sacrifice our freedoms to protect it.